Hi everyone, today I'm going to be teaching you how I created an expressive bee painting. It's a really basic, easy painting. Even though there's a lot going on, once you break it down, it's actually super simple, and I wanted to make sure that I shared all my little tips and tricks with you guys today. So keep watching to find out how I created this really easy bee tutorial. So to begin with, for this tutorial I created the colour palette for the bee, and this included really dark browns, vibrant yellows, the very stereotypical colours that you would think to use, and I began with the darkest colour, so that really dark brown. I used it to shape the face to begin with. As you can see, the eyes, I went around them as they're slightly lighter in the reference photo, so I wanted to map in the dark area around that to really tie it together later on. And I also created part of the body, leaving a little bit of a gap between each section where I could then put a light yellow later on. And by doing this already, you can see that the structure of the bee is already created, which is something that I really wanted to make sure to have from the get-go, as this is the focal point of the painting. You want your eyes to be drawn straight to that bee, so by getting in this dark colour and then working in the light later on, it helps with the transition. Everything just flows a lot nicer now that we've got this initial base structure. Just a little tip as well, if you have a brown within the colours that you're using and it's more on that warm side, just keeping it a little bit more vibrant, I added a little bit of blue to my brown, just a little bit, and that will create a more muted and dark brown, which is perfect for this particular piece. I then began with the background, and I wanted this to be really blurry as it is in the reference photo, but I wanted mine to have a little bit more of a loose feel to it. So I wasn't too worried about getting colours completely accurate. Yes, I still followed the reference photo, but I did use the wet in wet method and I let the colours blend naturally. I tried hard not to control them. So yeah, I do think sometimes it is better just to let things flow and see how it turns out, and it created a really nice blurry background. I used a variety of different colours for this, including a really light blue, so I just put a little bit of blue in the palette and added loads of water to get this as bright as possible, as that is fitting to the flowers that we'll be painting later, so it has a little bit more consistency in terms of the shade. And I also used a nice earth green and earth green mixed with brown, so you had that transition of dark to light within that green colour palette. And I painted around all of the flowers that are that more detailed focus that we'll be painting later on, as this is that blurry background. So I think it's really important to have that transition between the blurry background and the flowers, and this is the perfect way to do this, by not going into that area where it is a little bit more detailed and just focusing on the wet in wet method. So I left this painting overnight as I wanted to make sure all the layers had dried, especially that background. Working in the wet in wet method, I have found it does take a little bit longer to dry, and it does need to be dry before you go in with the rest of the colour, particularly for the flowers and the bee, as you don't want it to bleed into that background. You do want that nice separation. Once I had painted the centre of all of the flowers with that really bright yellow, I moved back to the bee. Painted in the eyes, as you can see, this is a lighter colour to what is surrounding it, as I mentioned earlier. And then I used more of a vibrant yellow ochre to fill in the rest of the bee. You may also notice that I avoid all of the wings that overlap into the bee for now, as I wanted to treat these as separate entities, as if you look at the reference photo, the wings are slightly lighter in comparison to the actual bee, so that overlap where the wings come over it does have more of a light, more muted colour palette, so I wanted to bear that in mind so that you could really see the separation between the two. So treating them separately will help you do that. And then using a really light blue, I went in and started painting the flowers. So I avoided some of the middle section where it went into that yellow area, as in the reference photo there was that more of a white section between blue and the yellow. So I left that completely bare, didn't want to put any colour down and take away from that really natural feel that the flowers had. But I'm being very calculated on where I'm putting this light blue. I didn't want to overlap any of the petals, so as you can see I'm working into completely random areas it looks like, but I'm just making sure that none of the wet petals are overlapping. So I can go back in, you'll see me do that, go back in and go over certain areas, but I wanted to make sure they dried at least a little bit so that you can really see the distinction between each individual flower. And I'm not adding any more colour to anywhere in particular, everything I'm keeping it pretty much the same, watering it down, keeping it very light, and you can very clearly see the distinction simply because I've let certain areas dry rather than going in and just painting a layer of colour over everything. It's very calculated where each section of colour is going. And then I went into some of the slightly darker areas with just a little bit more paint, so I didn't really water it down as much. But like I say, the majority of this base layer for the flowers is all the same shade. And then once everything had dried again, I went in with that really dark brown and filled in all of the missing pieces to the bee. Still kind of avoiding the wings, but because we've got that nice base layer down of the light baby blue, went in with the dark brown and started mapping in some of them lines. And I wasn't following the reference photo completely here. I think it's nice to branch out a little bit, as long as you've got the general formula in terms of the direction all these lines are going. It's nice to get a little bit creative, put a couple more in if you want, things like that. As it's not going to take away from the realism of the bee that we've painted so far. And you should really start to see everything coming together now. The bee is pretty much all finished. There's still a little gap between the bee and the wing that I want to fill in. I think I was letting things dry before I did this, but everything is pretty much, it's all coming together really nicely. And now we can go in with a really dark, deep blue, just to add in a little bit more detail to the flowers. So there's tiny little sections between all of these flowers where there's just a little bit of shadow created, mainly because everything's overlapping. So I filled all of that in, but the majority of this flower section is still relatively light. There's not that much shadow going on, so it is important to make sure you get them tiny little bits in there, and it just helps further emphasize the distinction between each flower. So it's these tiny little touches that really help tie everything together, and this is what's going to really help with the finish of the piece. And just the tiny little things, yes, it takes that little bit longer, but like I say, it's so worth it for the finish that you will find you have. And I also used a couple of dark brown little dots, put that into the centre of each flower. And such a simple step, but it really helps tie everything together. And you don't want to forget the two little bees, so I went back in and added that tiny bit more detail, finished the wings, more for the one on the left. I think a lot was needed for this one. I think because it was smaller and not really the focus of the painting, I kind of left it till the last minute, if I'm honest. So I would now take a step back and just identify if there's anywhere that has been missed, as this is the stage to get that down. And that is just going to help everything together and finish this piece. So that is how I recreated this super easy bee painting. As I've mentioned, it is super easy, anyone can do this painting, and the real-time tutorial is available over on my website, so make sure you check that out down below. You can also find links to my Patreon, social media pages where I go over daily things that I create over on there, like on TikTok, Instagram. Make sure you check that out, and yeah, make sure to like and subscribe for nature art content that I'll be posting regularly every Sunday. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!